Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for spending your Friday lunchtime with us. In around 30 minutes today, we're going to take a look at some of the key measures presented by the Chancellor in the budget last week and see what it all means for you, for the economy, and for your investments. First of all, however, just a very brief overview of asset intelligence and what we do, because I'm pleased to say we have some newer clients online with us today who might not know us as well. So asset intelligence portfolio management, or AIPM, is contracted by your financial advisor to provide the investment management for the assets that you hold with them. One way to think about it is that you and your advisor sit down together and determine the desired destination. Your advisor, using their expertise, chooses the best route and punches that into the sat-nav, and then they hand over the keys to AIPM to make sure there's enough fuel in the tank to get there. Our business is completely dedicated to investment management, so we can give it our full focus. As for me, my name is Kel Waniforo, investment specialist at Asset Intelligence, and I've been with the business for over 7 years now, analysing various economic, market and political developments. And for my sins and for what it's worth, over the course of my career now, I've dug into pushing 30 budgets, spring statements, autumn statements, fiscal events, and even, oh dear, mini budgets. Anyway, there we go. That's myself and the company covered off. Let's kick off this view of the budget by first looking at some of its key measures and possible financial planning implications. So this is likely to be the section of today's presentation where you may wish to listen most closely. So if you feel so inclined, get a pen and paper at the ready or tap out some notes on your phone. First off, thank you very much to those of you who sent in questions in advance or suggestions for items that we could cover. I've tried to include as much of what was requested as possible, though of course I haven't been able to cover everything off. Just briefly, there were a few topics that people brought up where, in fact, the budget ended up making no changes of any significance. These areas were pension drawdown, taking pension lump sums, the triple lock on the state pension, gifting for inheritance tax purposes, and stamp duty for property. So nothing to worry about on any of those. Okay, with that, let's take a closer look at what was in the budget. First off, there's been plenty of coverage of this one. The freeze on income tax and national insurance thresholds has been extended. This means that the personal allowance, the higher rate threshold, and the additional rate threshold will not rise to keep up with inflation each year. And basically that means that you pay more income tax and NI than you otherwise would have done, even if you don't get a pay rise, which is something that the media reports often miss. As a reminder, this was a policy originally introduced by the Conservative government in 2021 as a means to help pay back the enormous debts that we racked up during COVID. They set it to end in 2028, which was a stopping point that Rachel Reeves agreed to stick to in last year's budget. Yet it will now go on until 2031, by which time it will be raising the Chancellor an extra £8 billion a year. And on a cumulative basis, the freezing of the thresholds across that whole 10-year period will raise about £67 billion. So this is the budget's big revenue raiser. Next, as we know, Labour famously pledged not to raise taxes on working people, but that pledge isn't interpreted to apply to tax on income on assets. So most income from savings, dividends and property, which is not held within a tax-efficient wrapper, like an ISA or a pension, will see a tax hike of 2 percentage points in the coming years. And I'll go into a bit more detail about this one later on. Next up, fairly straightforward headline here, though there are some complexities that the government says it's still working out. But yes, if you are aged 65 or under, from April 2027, you will only be allowed to save up to £12,000 a year in a cash ISA, and that's down from the current £20,000. So to be clear, you'll have an overall ISA allowance still of £20,000 a year, but any contributions you want to make above £12,000 must now be held, or from April 27, must be held in investments rather than staying in cash. Now, what are some of those possible complexities that I mentioned that the government is consulting on? One is that it seems likely that they're going to stop the convertibility from a stocks and shares ISA into a cash ISA. And those of you with longer memories might recall that all of this, the cash portion limit and the transferability restrictions, they're actually pretty similar to how the ISA system used to work prior to reforms introduced by George Osborne back in 2014, so it's not entirely new. Next up, national insurance relief on salary sacrifice into pension schemes, which the government says mainly benefits those who earn higher amounts, and it's getting more and more expensive. That's going to be capped at £2,000 per employee from 2029. So that's still quite a way away, and again, this is another one we'll come back to look at in more depth later on. Next, the state pension will rise by 4.8% to just over £12,500 from April, in line with earnings growth and under the provisions of the triple lock. So nice and easy. One point worth raising on this, though, is just that the government have clarified that because the state pension will overtake the personal allowance of 12,570 in 2027, pensioners will not have to pay income tax on their state pension if that is their only source of income. Again, some of the details on this are yet to be worked out. How strict are the government going to be in terms of what counts as extra income, for example? So we'll find out in due course. Overall, though, this is good news if you or someone you know lives off of the state pension without any private provision. And next, another measure that made a fair few headlines, the new EVED, or electric vehicle excise duty. So this is going to be a new pence per mile charge, which the government says is intended to reflect the fact that electric vehicles still contribute to congestion and wear and tear on the roads. And of course, it's intended to start to replace the revenue that the Exchequer is going to lose from diminishing fuel duty receipts as more and more people buy EVs over the coming years. So a couple of interesting points here. The first is that the figures Rachel Reeves mentioned in her speech, which were 3 pence per mile for electric cars and 1.5 pence per mile for plug-in hybrids, they don't actually appear anywhere in the budget documentation itself. So those probably will be the figures, but it does just remain to be seen if they do definitely end up being the very final amounts. Second, the government says they want to target a yearly bill for the average EV driver, considering average mileage, of about £240. And the government says that's equivalent, or we're targeting the equivalent, of about half of what the average petrol or diesel driver pays in fuel duty. So they say an EV should still be cheaper to run, although of course they do also tend to be more expensive. We also heard about various modest measures to help with the cost of living, as much as the Chancellor could afford to give away within her strict fiscal rules. So prescription charges will be frozen at £9.90 in tax year 26-27. The £3 cap on bus fares will also go on for that year, and certain rail fares will also be frozen in 26-27. The 5p fuel duty cut, if you recall that was introduced by the last government after Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices shot up. That's going to continue until August next year, or we're going to start gradually winding it back by March 2027. So we can expect slightly higher fuel prices from then. Energy bills were supposedly going to be cut by £150, but it's gradually emerged that that's going to be offset by other levies and measures, so people will see an average fall of only about £83 after all, and actually even that will get cut away in subsequent years due to higher green investment levels. Okay, on we go just for a few more key measures. One is the new high value council tax surcharge for homes worth over £2 million, or the mansion tax as it's long been dubbed in the press. That will come into force from April 2028, and unfortunately there aren't many details yet available about how this is going to work, other than the fact the government have given a cost range of between £2,500 a year for properties at the lowest end there, up to £7,500 a year at the top end, which they've described as properties worth above £5 million. A couple of notes on this one too. The charge payable by the charge will be payable by property owners rather than occupiers. And two, in her budget speech, Rachel Reeves suggested that it would likely be possible to defer the charges until sale or after death, although again, the full details on that are yet to be finalised by the government. There has been speculation that interest payments on those deferrals could run as high as 4% above the base rate too, which is something to bear in mind. But yeah, that's again still yet to be fully confirmed. Next up, there's no change to the inheritance tax threshold. So that carries on at £500,000, including the residence nil rate band, or of course a combined transferable £1 million between spouses. These bands have also been frozen for years now, and unfortunately this is going to continue on for another 5.5 years at least. For those making use of agricultural or business property relief, the government is also introducing transferability of the relief for IHT purposes between spouses from the 6th of April, including if the first death actually occurs before that date. More on cars. Those of you in the market for a new set of wheels might be glad to hear, but it wasn't all bad news for electric vehicles, if that's what you're in the market for. If you've bought a new car in the past few years, you're probably familiar with the expensive car supplement. So this is basically a measure of it increases road tax quite a bit for 5 years after a car is first registered. It currently applies to all cars costing £40,000 or more when new, but from April 2026 for electric vehicles only, it's now only going to apply to models costing £50,000 or more. So a bit of relief there. Next up, not so good news, kind of budget nasty, which might have slipped through the net, as it was notably not mentioned in the Chancellor's speech on the day. But the tax relief available on investments in venture capital trusts is going to be cut from 30% to 20% from April next year. So please speak to your financial advisor if you do invest in VCTs or you were considering doing so about how this may affect your plans. And finally, in this rundown of key measures, perhaps particularly relevant for those of you who are business owners, or indeed just if you've got children or grandchildren starting out in the working world, there are going to be further above inflation rises for the national living wage and the national minimum wage. In particular, you can see the rise in the national minimum wage for 18 to 20-year-olds is very hefty at 8.5%. So that's more than double the current inflation rate, which is 3.6%. That also comes on top of a 16% rise last year on the national minimum wage. So the wage bill burden on businesses certainly is continuing to rise and rise. It's obviously great news if you have a job that's affected, but less good news for an economy that's already seen quite a consistent trend upwards in unemployment over the past 18 months. So there we have it. Those are the key budget measures as we see them. And of course, the precise effects on each of us will vary with our own personal circumstances, but hopefully at the end of this rundown, you're feeling more relief than despair, although not all will be so lucky, of course. I just want to turn now to pick out a handful of those policies that we've covered there and look at some added detail or key implications. First off, the freezing of the income tax thresholds. This chart shows the income level at which the high rate kicks in, which is £50,270. What it would have been this year had it risen with inflation over the past few years, and that's the purple bar. And then similarly, where it would end up by 2030-31, again, if it were going to rise in line with projected inflation, which of course we now know it is not. And we can see the enormous effects that this fairly dry-sounding change makes. By 2030-31, the threshold would be around £20,000 higher than it actually is going to be if it were set to keep up with rising prices. And the effect this can have on the amount of tax people actually end up paying is quite dramatic. For someone earning £70,000 in 2031, the threshold freeze means that by then they're going to be paying around £5,000 more in income tax alone than they would have done if the threshold had kept up with inflation and risen to about £70,000. And the frozen personal allowance as well also plays into this, so that's going to stay at 12,570, when if it were to rise with inflation, by then it would have risen to around £17,500. And this doesn't take into account the frozen national insurance thresholds either. So for something that sounds really quite technical, depending on how much you earn exactly, it can really start to squeeze your income. And the impact of this, just this latest extension to the freeze, so not even counting the 7 years that was set to be frozen prior, we'll see around 800,000 people more having to start paying the basic rate of income tax for the first time, and close to 1 million will start paying higher rate tax for the first time. In fact, by 2031, around a quarter of all income tax payers will be in the higher rate. And that's up from only about 5% when Nigel Lawson first introduced the 40% rate when he cut it from 60 back in his famous 1987 budget. So quite big changes there. Okay, let's take a closer look now at the higher taxes coming in on savings, dividends, and property income. So for the most part, as you can see, taxes from asset income are going to rise by 2 percentage points almost across the board here. The only exception is dividend income for additional rate taxpayers, which you can see there sees no increase. It's also worth noting that the dividend tax increases kick in from 2026, whereas the extra savings on the extra tax on savings and property income are from 2027. So just as an aside, why the government doing this other than to raise revenue, of course? Well, the narrative is that because people in paid employment have to pay income tax and national insurance, that seems unfair compared to the fact that there's no NI on savings, dividends and property income. So the government is saying it's fair to try and close that gap a bit. Of course, some of the impacts here can be mitigated by making as full a use as you can of your ISA allowances each year, as well as your personal savings allowance. And remember, this allows basic rate taxpayers to earn £1,000 worth of interest outside of an ISA or pension per year tax-free. High rate payers are allowed £500, although I'm afraid if you're an additional rate payer, unfortunately you don't get any additional allowance. Also, if you earn less than effectively £18,570, you can also earn up to £5,000 of interest tax-free with something known as the starting rate for savings. So it's worth looking into how that works too. Finally, let's have a closer look at the changes to salary sacrifice. So for those who've never used salary sacrifice, it's worth just defining the term first. It's something you hear a lot about, but not everyone might know what it is. So salary sacrifice refers to agreeing to give up part of your pay in return for employer-provided benefits, like a pension. So this can be a very efficient way of accessing this kind of benefit, as technically having technically lower pay means you have lower income tax and NI liabilities. So that's the broad background. What is changing with the new £2,000 NI cap? The first thing to say is that the cap will apply to employees' contributions only. Payments by employers will not be under scope with this. So who is it really going to affect? Given the level of the cap, in a situation where the employee is paying the minimum contribution of 5% of their pay into a pension and the employer is paying the 3% minimum, then workers who earn around £40,000 and above, they're going to be the ones to breach this £2,000 cap and start to lose the benefits of NI relief above that. In practice, this means that those earning between about £40,000 a year and £50,270, they're going to feel the most pain from this. Now, why is that? It's because earnings over 5270 only attract an NI rate of 2% anyway. Below that rate is a much more significant 8%. So basic rate taxpayers earning enough to breach the new cap, but below the higher rate threshold, they're hardest hit. Time will tell, but it is possible that employers will restructure the pension plan benefits they offer to mitigate the negative impacts for their employees, perhaps by shifting benefits to employer contributions. However, with last year's hike in employers' NI taking their contributions to 15%, that would be quite a costly way to proceed for many firms. What I'd stress on this, though, is just that it's all still so far away. So it's set to come in 2029. There's no additional planning that most people need to do now. We'll keep it under advisement, and no doubt your advisors will look at the implications with you if you are affected closer to the time. So hopefully that's been, whatever your circumstances, whatever your stage of life, hopefully a useful look at understanding how this year's budget might affect you and your finances. So next, let's move on to look at the potential impacts for the economy overall. Conveniently, for those of you in a hurry, I'm happy to give a very clear, very short answer on the key question on this front. Will the package of budget measures directly do much to boost economic growth? I'm afraid the answer is no. There wasn't really much in the budget that even seemed intended to offer a lot of stimulus to the economy. Don't get me wrong, some of what was announced will have positive effects on growth at the margins. For example, ending the two-child benefit cap, that will put more money into some people's pockets. Again, the boost to the minimum wage, again, boost spending power for some families. High pensions as well, that has the potential to help consumption a bit next year too. But there was no headline-grabbing growth initiative in this budget. And that's not just my opinion. The government's independent economic forecaster, who we've heard a lot about lately, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they found that no individual measure will have a statistically significant positive effect on economic growth. That's quite remarkable when you think about it. In fact, we can see on the chart here that taking into account the projected impacts of all the new budget measures, the OBR have actually downgraded their growth forecasts for future years compared to what they thought was going to happen back in March. So you can see the blue bars in their latest forecast for 26, 27, 28 onwards, all lower, unfortunately, than what they thought would occur in March. And when you look at where the money from a tax rises is set to be spent, two real aims of the budget become clear. The first was boosting welfare, so it's ending that two-child cap I've just mentioned, as well as budgeting for the reversals on the winter fuel payment and the cuts that were planned to disability benefits, both of which caused a fair bit of uproar among Labour MPs and members and had to be undone. The second aim, which unfortunately does sound quite tediously technical, was increasing the fiscal headroom. No doubt you've all heard this term quite a bit on the news too lately, but what is it? So the fiscal headroom refers to how much of a cash buffer there is in the Chancellor's tax and spending plans before she would end up breaking her self-imposed fiscal rules. For example, if tax revenues were to come in weaker than expected, or spending for whatever reason, if that turned out to be higher than expected. Basically, one way to think about it is imagine you have an amount in mind that you didn't want to exceed on an overdraft. So you decide to target keeping the overdraft a little bit lower than that amount. That buffer you'd be giving yourself, that's the equivalent to Rachel Reeves's fiscal headroom for the country. Now, I know this is a bit dry, but it is important because it feeds into where I think the budget might actually have its most positive effects. The higher taxes mean that Rachel Reeves has increased her fiscal headroom from 9.9 billion in last year's budget and in this year's spring statement. That's now up to 21.7 billion pounds. So it means that there's extra space if tax revenues do come in a little bit weaker than expected, or the government ends up spending more, for example, on unemployment benefits and so on. She's got a bigger buffer before she'd have to either cut spending or come back to raise taxes again. So this just means that the whole country has to worry much less now about potentially being buffeted off course. We've kind of had 2 years in a row of this psychodrama around the fiscal headroom, of this talk that there's a black hole in the finances because spending's been high and we've exceeded the buffer and we're not going to meet the target, and which taxes are going to go up to fill it. We had that with Budget 2024 and we've had it this year as well. And it's quite damaging. It's not all just talk in the news. Businesses put off investment. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that it feeds into weaker consumer confidence, so people are less happy to spend. So I think the fact that we've now got this bigger buffer on the fiscal headroom, which we can see in the chart here, so much higher than we've seen in past budgets, does mean that there's a good chance that when we get to next year's budget and the run up to that, that there's going to be a lot less talk about need for further tax rises or filling further black holes. And that greater stability is always good for engendering confidence. The other positive mechanism in a slightly strange way, is actually the tax rises themselves. So that will suck demand out of the economy. It means people have less to spend. I know that doesn't sound like a good thing, and of course it won't be popular. It'll be painful for almost all of us. But that should help with bearing down on inflation over the years ahead. You do get a sort of less spending power in the economy. It's not good for economic growth, but it does help cut the pressure on boosting price rises over the year ahead. We've had inflation at quite elevated levels for most of the past few years now, so the more progress we can make on getting back down to normal levels, to our 2% target, that could potentially be quite beneficial over the years ahead. Finally, just a reminder of why all this really matters, getting some growth. I think this chart is really remarkable. So what it shows is productivity, really, output per worker. And you can see that, so this chart goes back to 1997. You can see the trend there going up to the financial crisis in 2008. And you can see just how far since then we've been off course on this measure. So it's been a real problem with getting the economy growing, with getting both labour productivity, but also productivity from invested capital in terms of plant and IT equipment and so on, getting the most bang for our buck out of that. And what's really remarkable, this chart again looks quite technical. What this actually translates to, the projection is, if we'd have stayed on that trend line of getting output per worker on the same growth rate as before, the average person would be £15,000 better off in terms of the wages they're paid today than they actually are. So there's been an enormous loss to per capita income because of this weak productivity growth. The difficult thing with the government is, in addition to trying to fix that, trying to get that growth back on target, there's other enormous long-term pressures and challenges in the system too. So you can see the chart on the left here, there's been a massive rise ever since COVID in the number of people of working age who are claiming some kind of long-term sickness benefit. And this kind of has a twofold negative hit, because one, you have to pay, of course, for welfare payments for those people to live, but also it means they're not playing the fullest role that they can in the workforce. Fewer workers available. That also adds to inflation pressure, because there's a smaller pool of working people remaining, so it's very costly. The chart on the right there just shows, it's a very long-term chart going back to the 1950s, the amount spent on health and defence. So the amount spent on health is the green line. You can see that's consistently risen over time as people's demands on the NHS have gone up, but also as the population has aged, that bill keeps rising and rising and rising. Jumped up with COVID as well. And that's only set to continue, because unfortunately the population is projected to continue getting, frankly, sicker and older over the decades ahead. But at the same time, the government's got to square that with the sort of mauve line there on defence spending, which has been cut over the years, taking advantage of that Cold War peace dividend. Unfortunately, that's also got to go in reverse now. Now the government's committed to spending a lot more on defence, actually, by the early 2030s to combat the sort of negative behaviour of Russia. So when you put all this together, it's a really difficult circle to square, and I think it's fair to say it'd be difficult for any party in government to make all this add up. Finally, just briefly, please stick with us as we come on to the final stage of our budget examination extravaganza, the potential effects on your investments. So we've already covered that tax rises and freezes are likely to be good for inflation, which has been a problem in recent years, as we covered. In turn, of course, getting inflation down will translate into interest rate cuts over the medium term. So we've currently got interest rates at 4%. It's quite possible, if we stay on this path of bearing down on inflation, we can get to a neutral rate on interest rates, a sort of steady state where they're sort of neither restricting economic growth nor aiding it, of around 2.75 to 3% seems like the likely landing zone. So we've had 5 rate cuts already since last year, and the budget's tax rises and the fact that the government is sticking to this grip on the fiscal rules should see us on the right path in this respect. So we can expect, as I say, a few more cuts over the medium term. And in addition to the Bank of England's own rate cuts, we do think the government's cost of borrowing will drift lower over the months ahead too. And that's really important because it feeds into costs across the economy, it feeds into consumer credit costs, feeds into the costs of loans for businesses. So getting that down will help investment too. In fact, mortgages, which have been a real pain point over the past few years, they are also set to start stimulating the economy again rather than holding it back. And this chart explains why. So it's a bit complicated, but the light blue line there shows the effective rate on all outstanding mortgages. Of course, it doesn't change quite as quickly because these days most people are on fixed rate mortgages. The navy line shows the rate you have to pay to take out a new mortgage. So what you can see is back around late 2021 and onwards, the cost of a new mortgage has been above the cost of all mortgages already in force because we've had this big rise in interest rates. What's interesting now is more and more people have remortgaged. The stock of existing mortgages on that light blue line has risen. But actually, because we've started to have some interest rate cuts and we're projected to get more ahead, you can see that the rates for new mortgages on the darker blue line has started to come down. And we're getting very close to where we're going to have a crossover point where once again, the cost of a new mortgage is going to be slightly lower than what people are likely to be paying before. That will be really beneficial because it's going to free up people's spending to spend on other things over the next couple of years ahead. So that's, again, it's an indirect sort of budget effect of the government's strategy, but should really help over the coming years. It's worth adding that interest rate cuts also tend to be beneficial for smaller companies and companies which tend to be more domestic facing, and we've got exposure to funds capturing this type of style in most of our portfolios. We can also see on this chart, which just shows the amount of money that people are putting into the UK stock market, we can see that confidence is returning, funnily enough, among investors who don't live in the UK. So on the navy line there, which shows the amount foreign investors are putting into our market, you can see there's been quite a tick up recently, and that's because people are finding the valuations of the UK market attractive after we've had a period of sort of a long period, taking it in the round, sort of 15 years or so of relatively weaker performance, and also signs that people want to diversify their exposure to the big US technology companies, which are incredibly profitable and have performed really well, but signs that people want to kind of just bring in a bit of balancing exposure there too. Ultimately though, while this is a positive sign, we do think it's important to remember, and we can see on this slide, that the UK is actually a really small share of the global stock market overall by value. So you can see on this slide that really global markets are dominated by America. About 2/3 of the value of all companies is accounted for by America. And along with other key economies, you can see there, everywhere else is kind of a minnow by comparison. We have, and this sort of influences how much we invest in the UK AIPM. We actually have less invested in the UK in most of our portfolios than the typical UK investment manager. So we take a very global approach to running our portfolios, and that's served us really well over the past few years. So I think it's just a reminder that, perhaps from an investment perspective at least, don't need to pay headlines around the UK too much mind, because as you can see, relatively small share of the global market, and then that feeds into exposure in the portfolios too. So just a quick recap, what does the budget mean for you? Most likely, depending on circumstances, it means higher taxes on working and on assets, and through that cash ISA cut, reduced incentives to save, alongside the higher rates on savings income and so on. But above inflation increases on state pension and on the national living wage and minimum wage too, and that's likely to feed into wages a bit higher up the scale too. For the economy, it was largely a sort of steady as she goes budget. Unfortunately, economic growth does seem set to remain mainly sluggish, but that indirect effect of, say, sticking to the fiscal rules, of putting some tax rises through, it'll be painful in the short term, but eventually will help bear down on inflation and feed through to interest rates, which is more positive. Finally, for investments, greater stability. in terms of increasing that fiscal headroom. That was great to see, and that could help keep that overseas interest in our market that we've seen recently going. Government borrowing costs should also fall by, again, sticking to being, sticking quite tightly to the debt rules, which again should feed through into keeping inflation under control. And that's really important because it means lower consumer credit costs, business loans and mortgages, as well as the effect on the government's borrowing costs itself. But also, as I say, keep in mind that the UK isn't the be-all and end-all. Across our portfolios, we've got a lot invested around the globe, giving you access to that fullest opportunity set to make sure that you have as much potential in your portfolios as there can possibly be. And that's all from me today. Thank you so much for spending your Friday lunchtime with us. There's a lot more we could talk about, but time is always limited with this kind of thing. If there is anything on your mind, sort of burning questions that we haven't had time to cover, please do get in touch via your advisor and we'll get back to you. But yeah, thanks again, and I hope it's been of interest. Bye for now and enjoy the weekend. Thank you.